Today we have a game between Daniil Dubov and Maxime vachier-lagrave, who just won the World Blitz Championship. Now, you know Daniil Dubov, right? I mean, he's like the coolest chess cat on the planet. He dresses high-end, swank. I mean, the big branded, expensive. He's got Gucci written across his chest, Balenciaga written across his chest. I mean, he's a cool cat. In fact, I thought, in honor of him, I might wear my fake Burberry scarf that I've got, but I said, you'll see right through that, so I'm not gonna do that for this thing. Suffice to say, Daniil Dubov's chess play is entertaining enough. Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John. Daniil Dubov has the white pieces, and vachier-lagrave has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. Dubov plays e4. Lagrave responds with a Sicilian, knight f3, d6, and instead of the open Sicilian, Dubov plays bishop to b5, check, a very popular anti-Sicilian line. Lagrave responds with bishop to d7, and here, look at what Dubov does. He takes the bishop, and the queen recaptures, and now c4. So what he's done is he's created a Maroczy bind structure with the light-squared bishop already off the board, and that's considered the bad bishop because those central pawns on c4 and e4 are also on light squares. Believe it or not, it's kind of debatable whether or not that's a good thing. It's true you're getting rid of a bad bishop. However, you're also trading off a piece in a position where you have more space. So that's where we go from here. Knight f6 hitting the e4 pawn, knight c3 defending it. g6. White has weak dark squares in the center, the d4 square in particular. So black plans to play the bishop to g7 to help control those squares. Castles, bishop to g7, d4, cd4, knight d4. So this is what we have, a Maroczy bind with the light squared bishops off the board. But pair of minor pieces having been exchanged. Black castles. And black actually has a pretty decent score in this position. Black's main target right now is the c4 pawn. Obviously, these two pawns limit black's pawn breaks at b5 and d5. So black's going to start by targeting that c4 pawn and put as much pressure on it as possible. Bishop to e3, rook to c8. Even before the queen's knight is developed, he's immediately going after the c4 pawn. b3 to defend it. Lagrave plays knight to g4, irritating that bishop on e3. That's a very valuable minor piece for white. He doesn't want that exchange to be made, so he moves it to g5. And this is the first original move of the game. This is the game's novelty. This position had been reached once before, and white played the bishop to c1 in that game. h6, bishop h4, knight to c6, attacking the d4 knight twice with the bishop at g7 and the knight at c6. Knight takes c6. Now, black can take this one of three ways. He decides to take with the pawn. Now, this pawn on c6, came from b7, helps control the d5 square and gives black a little more control of the center. The downside is it now blocks the rook. The rook was on a half-open file, putting pressure on white's position. That file is now blocked, and black is going to have to find another weakness in white's position to target. Dubov plays queen to d2. Black plays g5. Now what this does, it kicks the bishop back. It also sort of preserves that e5 square, so the pawn can't be played to f4 without a weakness being created. The problem with the move is that it creates weaknesses for black's position also. The square at f5 and h5 are now weak, and white might be able to put something on one of those squares. The bishop goes back, queen to e6, rook a to c1, rook to d8, preparing perhaps to play d5 and break open in the center. h3, kicking the knight, now knight to e5. This is the e5 square I was talking about earlier when black played g5. Now in this position, white can, and maybe even should, play f4. After pawn takes, bishop takes, white has a weakness on e4, that's true. And the e5 point is a strong point. However, that rook at f1 now has a half-open file aiming at black's king. And so white gets compensation for the pawn weaknesses if Dubov had chosen to go this route. Instead, he plays queen to e2, and that puts some pressure on h5. A white queen sitting on h5 would be very irritating for the black pieces. The knight goes to g6. Black is playing for control of the kingside dark squares. The knight at g6 controls f4, also h4. The bishop at g7 can come to e5, and black is trying to get a bind on the dark squares on the king side. Rook f to e1, bishop to e5, just as we said. Now knight to d1. Dubov recognizes that the g5 move created these weaknesses, and now the knight can go from c3 to d1, then to e3, and then boom, pop into f5. Lagrave does not want white's knight on f5. That's a strong square. It's very irritating. It's around the king. It hits the h6 pawn. That would be really nice for Dubov if he could pull that off. Bishop takes g3. This creates a weakness. A couple of them, really. One on g3 and one on e4. But it gets rid of the dark square bishop defending black's king. So there's always these trade-offs. Queen to e5, hitting the g3 pawn. And white hops right in with the knight to e3. Now, black's position to the eye looks pretty decent. I mean, if you just count up the positional factors, there are weaknesses for white at e4 and g3, for example. The problem is king safety. That's a big issue here. Black's king is a bit less safe than white's king, and white's pieces are a little bit better developed. So white has dynamic compensation for black's static pawn structure advantages. Now, Lagrave plays e6. He wants to keep that knight out of f5, but the e4 pawn is hanging. He could just take it, and that's playable, but really dangerous. Dubov could just play queen to f2, and now knight f5 is threatened with a discovery from the e1 rook. And if the queen, say, moves to d4, then just rook c to d1. And now white, for the cost of a pawn, it has really well-placed pieces, is pushing black's queen all around. That would be a very risky decision to take that e4 pawn. So instead he plays e6 to keep the knight out of the f5 square. But now that pawn at d6 is a little soft. It's not quite as sturdy as it was before. Dubov plays queen to f2, king to h2 with the idea of the queen going to h5 might be a good idea. It's what the computer's first recommendation is, defending the pawn with the king and not the queen. Queen goes to f2. Now h5, that's the reason why this is better, because the queen prevents the pawn going to h5. Well, what's the big deal about the pawn moving to h5? Well, remember I said that black wants to control and dominate the dark squares on the king side. By playing h5, h4, and hitting g3, it allows black to get a further bind on those kingside dark squares. That's the real advantage of this h5, h4 idea. Rook c to d1. Beginning to pile up. He sees that pawn at d6 is sensitive. Lagrave plays queen to h8. Now, this is a very sort of alpha zero kind of move. It's not the best move in the position. It's a little passive here. He wants to support that pawn going to h4, but this is definitely the kind of move we've seen AlphaZero play, and you can already see the influence of these advanced neural network computers on the best players in the world. Dubov ignores it, begins to pile up on d6 with rook to d2. Rook to d7, defending, boom, boom. Now watch this maneuver. This is a great maneuver. Positional advantages in chess, particularly when you have a strong opponent, aren't just given to you. You have to create them. You have to fight to create them. Watch how Dubov fights to create a great square for his knight. He piles up on d6. Now, c5. The pawn cannot take the pawn at c5 because there's a pin down the file. Black would lose a rook. So he plays d5. Now, what? Boom, knight to c4. The knight can't be taken because of the same pin, and now the knight is hopping right in to the d6 square. Really an impressive display of tactics mixing with strategy and positional understanding. h4, continuing that dark square plan on the king side. The knight hops into d6. hg3, queen g3, queen to h4. Lagrave would love to trade queens. That would definitely reduce white's pressure considerably. So Dubov is having nothing to do with that, moving the queen away to c3. So black plays g4, an aggressive move. But This aggressive move doesn't quite work because of a really nice defensive maneuver from Dubov. This is really, really cool. First of all, he takes on d5, takes with the pawn. Then Lagrave captures with the c pawn. He could take with the e pawn, but then after something like rook to d3, rook goes to g3, rook goes to f1, he's putting all kinds of pressure on the f and g files. Plus, the pawns are much weaker. He has 3 pawn islands instead of the 2 he has after taking with the c pawn. Rook to d4. He pins the g pawn to the queen, the pawn that just moved to g4. The queen goes back to h8, and that creates a pin on that d4 rook. So the rook can't take the pawn at g4 because the queen at c3 would fall. Instead, he could defend g4 with f5, but then after, say, queen e1, takes, white has so much pressure on black's center, it's almost impossible to defend. How do you defend e6? If he plays rook to e7, pawn takes, rook takes g4, and white's just completely winning. So he goes ahead and plays queen to h8, pinning the rook on d4 to the queen at c3, and then Dubov takes on g4 with the pawn instead. Lagrave centralizes the queen, rook to e1 hitting the queen goes back, b4. Now these queenside pawns are monsters. These b and c pawns are they're beastly. Very, very hard to stop. In fact, they're so hard to stop, Lagrave doesn't even bother. He gives up an exchange, rook for a knight, and gets another pawn in order to stop these pawns from advancing. Rook d6, c d6, rook takes, d6, b5. So now Dubov is going to advance the A and B pawns and try to win on the queen side. In fact, this is the big finale. I got to put on my fake Burberry scarf in honor of Dubov's impressive chess. I just got to put on the fake scarf. All right. A6, A4, takes. The B pawn is the primary weapon Dubov is going to use, advancing that, threatening to queen it. Rook to b6, blockading the pawn. Rook to b1, backing it up. Queen to e5, you got to get the queen over there. Queen to d2 to get out of the pin that black had on the rook at d4. King to g7, queen to f2, queen to f6. Now rook to a4. And this unleashes a threat against the rook at b6, forcing black to be the one to exchange queens on f2. Take here. If he instead plays, say, queen to d8 to try to defend it, after rook a7, there's way too much pressure on the f7 pawn, and the queen, you still have to worry about the sensitivity of the b6 rook. After something like knight h8, rook f1, the attack will be decisive. So black has to take, king takes f2, knight e5, king to e3. He doesn't care about that g4 pawn. He's just trying to get over to the queen side with his king as fast as possible. Rook to b7, king to d4, knight to d7. Lagrave wants to keep that king out. So the knight at d7 controls the c5 and the e5 squares. Rook to a6. He has a nice idea here. He wants to play the rook to c6, then b6, then rook c7, kind of a stair-step maneuver. King to f6. You see the illustration there, the stair-step. Rook to c6, king to e7, g5. Puts a bit of a bind on those pawns on the king side. Dubov can still use that pawn to his advantage later if he needs to. Knight to b5, hitting the rook at c6. And white says, I don't care. You can take my rook. I'll give the exchange back. And he plays king to c5. The dominance of his king is more important than the material in this position. Knight to d7 check. If he actually were to just take, then king takes, rook to b8, king to c7. And the pawn can only be stopped by black sacrificing his rook for it. So he doesn't want to do that. So he brings the knight back to d7 and check. King to b4 to maneuver that king to a6. He's going to bring it on the other side of the board. Knight e5, rook to a6, knight to d3 check, king to e5, knight e5, b6, knight c6 check, king to b5, king to d6, trying to hold on. The rook goes to a8. And what that does is it gives white's king a square to go to on that to a6. It can sneak in there now. e5, rook to c1, hitting the knight on c6 twice, forcing the knight to move. And in this position, Maxime vachier-lagrave resigned to Daniil Dubov. Now, what would happen, let's say he played knight to d4 check, trying to continue the game, then king to a6, rook to d7, and b7. And black would have to give up the rook, and white would have a decisive material advantage. A great performance by Dubov, and really a fun game. Join us again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.